my name is Marty Chen, and I teach here at the Harvard Kennedy School, and it's my great pleasure to welcome two people from the World Bank who were on the team that produced the World Development Report 2013 on jobs. And there's Jessica Henschel, who they both now have new incarnations at the bank. And Jessica is working in human development for the South Asia region. And Dina Reingold is working on social protection in the Africa region. So they tell me that they've gone to high-level intensity to normal level intensity now that they're no longer on the WDR team. And we had worked quite closely together over a period of almost a year, right? And so it's a great pleasure. I heard they were coming to teach in Michael Walton's course this afternoon. I actually persuaded them to change the date because I was away. I just returned on Sunday from many weeks of travel. So it's a real pleasure, and I want to thank the Human Rights Professional Interest Council, and I'm still looking for Lipsy, who hasn't come yet, for co-sponsoring this, and also the Carr-Ryan Center for Human Rights for co-sponsoring this, with the WIGO Secretariat that I represent is housed here at the Hauser Center. So Jessica is going to start. He's going to give the overview on the WDR, and Dina will speak to the sort of sub-theme on economic rights and voice and social cohesion that was part of one of the cross-cutting themes of the WDR. And then I will speak about a set of case studies that the WIGO network was commissioned to do on economic rights representative voice. And one of the co-authors of one of the case studies, Lucia Fernandez, is here. So if you have questions about the really interesting case on waste pickers in Bogota, Colombia, she's the expert on that. So, Jessica.
Well, thank you so much. Lovely to be here on your first day back, and thanks so much for coming, all of you. It's really a pleasure to be discussing and dialoguing with you about this World Development Report, which Dina and I have been working on in the core team for the past year or year and a half. Just one word about the kind of these World Development Reports in general. The title is Jobs. You see it here in lots of different languages, and I'll explain a little bit what we mean by jobs and how we approach jobs in a quite comprehensive and developmental view and concept. But these World Development Reports, just one word, what they try to do, they generally take a topic which a lot of people and a lot of academics and students are thinking about and working on, and shed a little bit of a new light on it. At least a new light from the World Bank's perspective. Many of the things which I might say might for you be, we've been talking about this for decades, but for us trying to look at jobs in a very multidimensional way, was definitely something new and we enjoyed. These World Development Reports are done with a lot of people. We have a core team, but then interactions over this year are very intense and extraordinarily rewarding. We had an advisory panel made up of quite a few academics, like George Akerlof was in there, or John Hultiwander from Maryland, but also really activist types, and also those who moved the debate on work and on jobs quite a bit along. So we had El Abad in our advisory council, who provided actually a lot of very interesting and very good ideas and feedback. We went to, I think, about 24 countries in this period and tried to engage with stakeholders in the countries themselves. We had a very intense dialogue with the ILO, and obviously the ILO is core to the topic of jobs and work and employment, but also with the International Trade Union Council. And then we were fortunate to people like Marty, who along the way really provided a lot of, shaped a lot of our thinking in very specific areas. Marty is going to talk a little bit about this later on, but we had about, I think, 50 background papers, and a couple of them are really core and shaped good parts of the report, and this is definitely one of them which we'll be discussing a little bit later on. So what are the main messages, we call them Twitters, which come out of the WDR, and here are a couple of them, only a couple out of those which you find in the report. The first is that very often, at least in the economic discourse, we think of jobs coming after growth or economic change. So, opening the Financial Times or the New York Times for that matter says, this country grew by X%, and that was the result for the creation of jobs. And just think about the US itself. However, after this is kind of spending quite a bit of time this year bringing together literature and evidence from many fields, we think a good part of that causality runs actually the other way around, that jobs themselves drive development, and that jobs are necessary for economic and social development to take place. Economic jobs shape the way people work themselves out of poverty. Jobs shape the way people interact with each other, which actually drives productivity. The biggest changer of productivity across the world is knowledge exchange, people influencing each other in a positive way. And third, jobs are absolutely core and important for the social fabric of nations. And in that, jobs are really a very important ingredient in shaping norms and behaviors of individuals, and through that they shape how communities and societies function. So a good part of what we wanted to do is, at least for the discourse of the World Bank, is to flip the argument and not only put growth first and jobs as a derivative, but put really jobs first. The second is, you see in the Twitter, it's not just the number of jobs, and with that we wanted to say, clearly importantly, it's the quality of jobs. But more importantly, jobs are more than the individual value. When we think about jobs and work, we tend to focus on individual circumstances. The income that comes from a job, maybe if it comes with a certain insurance, or the risks that come with it, especially in informal employment. However, many jobs have a social value in addition to this individual value. So the social value can be raising people out of poverty. If societies have as a goal that people shouldn't be living in poverty, then every job that raises the welfare of people at the bottom of the income distribution would have a social benefit in addition to the individual benefit to the family itself or the household. Second, what I said earlier, if jobs really bring people into contact with each other, and this is how productivity grows, by you sitting in a classroom, by you interacting with people all around the world about new ideas, then there is a real spillover from jobs for the society. And third, the same thing can be said about the social fabric, social cohesion, as we call it in the report, in that if jobs shape norms and behaviors in a positive but also sometimes in a negative way, then the individual economic benefit or the insurance from a job is not all that counts, but there is something else which drives social development. Third, job challenges are really enormously varied. If we compare India with 90% in informal employment, no matter how we want to define informal employment, there's a whole literature about definitions of informality, to post-conflict settings like Kosovo or Afghanistan or Sierra Leone or Liberia and other countries, it is very difficult to come up with the 3-4 things to do for job creation around the world. It's actually impossible. However, what we think, and that's what we try to do in the report, is define and characterize jobs challenges according to the demographic, the institutional, and the economic setting of specific countries. rather than going by Latin America versus Africa and South Asia, which often leads to generalizations which we think are not that helpful for policy discussions. And lastly, a good part, again, of the labor economics literature when thinking about jobs goes directly in the labor market. So you assess, well, are there regulations that hinder firms from hiring? Is there collective bargaining that leads to a distortion in quotation marks in prices? Are there active labor market policies like wage subsidies, which might help some, but really provide a disincentive for others? So very often we go to the labor market proper. And that we felt, after studying quite a bit of the studies that came out of the last 10 years, is probably a misrepresentation, in that the major constraints to job creation, as we call it, good jobs for development, those that have that social positive additional value, that the major constraints to job creation often is not in the labor market proper. It has relatively little to do with how collective bargaining is organized, how social insurance is financed, or the labor market regulations. But it's somewhere else, and we'll talk about this along the way. It can be with urbanization policies. It can be with how smallholder farmers actually have access to necessary inputs and other rather broader development topics. Just quickly, what do we actually mean with a job? And we have one of the big discussions we had during the preparation of the report is job actually the right title? And Elabat was very vocal, and Renana Ben and Marty as well, is saying, well, don't call it jobs, your report, call it work or call it employment. Now, we made a conscious decision to talk about jobs because we wanted to analyze the work and employment both from a household point of view as well as from a firm point of view. And once you go to a firm point of view, you're looking at the changes in the number of workplaces for jobs, which gave us a very good handle to look at the productivity changes associated with structural change. But jobs for us, job for us is any work that is remunerative, so that has either a monetary or a non-monetary value attached to it, but at the same time that does not violate human rights. So we have a kind of a clear floor, which are basically the core labor standards, so any involuntary work, slave labor, bonded labor, jobs that is discriminatory, that does not allow for collective bargaining. For us, actually no jobs. That's forms of work which violate human rights are, in our definition, not jobs. To give you some figures, using that definition, we actually find in the world today about 3 billion jobs. Now, half of these are in farming and self-employment. So, knowing that about half of all these work relations are without an employer and an employee who kind of are in a formal relationship or in an informal relationship, means we also have to rethink as to how we approach the study of jobs, in that we need to worry about small-scale farmers and we need to worry about micro-firms when we think about jobs. And we cannot only go to what very often is the discourse in the industrialized countries as to relationships which are based on salary work. This is our Greek temple, in which we try to link jobs, no connotations to the crumbling of the Greek temple at this point. You see it here, well in the life, working through the centuries, so to speak. We have jobs at the bottom, and then we have 3 pillars. One is living standards, so this is how people get better in terms of their welfare, how they get out of poverty, female labor force participation. All that is included in the living standard pillar. The second is productivity. How do firms increase their productivity by undergoing technological change? What jobs are lost? What jobs are gained? And the third is the social cohesion pillar, which links the job and the individual job holder to the community and the society more broadly, and shows how, and we venture to go into the topic of how jobs actually shape these interactions, which Dina will talk about a little bit. Now, the concept I outlined at the very beginning is that some jobs can actually do more for society than others, in that they have a social value attached to them, which is higher than the individual value, is what we call good jobs for development, and we give examples of these type of jobs. And I just want to show you or talk you through 3 of them. One is jobs that empower women. Very often in development, especially in developing countries with relatively low female labor force participation, can have such a high social and developmental value. Examples abound. Think about the studies that look at how female earnings in households are spent differently than male earnings. And we know that the propensity of female earnings to be spent on education and health and nutrition of the children is higher. So that means that by raising female labor force participation, there's really a higher investment into the next generation. So there's a clear developmental gain. And you see it from case studies in Bangladesh, how that happens not only in the families in which the women started to participate, especially in the garment industries, but also in the surrounding, in the communities, where education enrollment increased significantly if some women started to have access. So again, a real spillover. Thank you so much. So I told Margaret I'm German, so I talk a lot. So I'm getting these nuggets. So 20 more minutes I have. She said 2. So that's an example where a job really has a developmental value. Another one is in functional cities. We know that growth, economic growth, in the end is driven by agglomeration economies which really happen in functioning cities. Because what I said at the very beginning is that people influence each other, that one firm next to another firm exchanges technological insights. People meet and discuss business techniques. And these agglomeration economies are one of the main drivers of economic growth all over the world, but especially we've seen it in the East Asian development model over the last 20 or 30 so years. So again here, a job in a functional city then is more than the individual income. It has an impact on the productivity of other jobs. And lastly, jobs that give a sense of fairness. We've looked at qualitative surveys as well as value surveys from around the world, and we find that how people judge the labor market in terms of fairness, how it works, is fundamental and instrumental how they judge society overall. So if people have the idea, well, I'm only going to get a job if I know the brother-in-law of my father's former classmate from Harvard, just to say, Harvard, here we go in Harvard, that means that it's much more connections than merit that counts. And fairness in the labor market means that merit, so the effort and the education of individuals would be counted for. So again here we have a spillover. If a job is obtained in a fair way that is really based on merit, then the attitude, the norm and behavior of the individual towards society is going to change, and we have quite a bit of empirical work on that in the report. I'm going to skip this slide and go to our typology of jobs challenges. So rather than having Africa, Latin America, South Asia, and East Asia, what we have come up with are different jobs challenges. And in each of these, we try to identify, well, what jobs really have this developmental value which goes beyond the individual. We distinguish agrarian economies from conflict-affected countries, those in urbanizing environments where they try to bring out these agglomeration economies I talked about, resource-rich countries where very often the resource extraction can lead to high growth but not to job creation. Example from Papua New Guinea where the gas, a huge natural gas investment will be worth 200% of GDP over the next couple of years, but create only about 1,000 jobs. So without linking resource riches to wider development, that's a very particular jobs challenge. Small island nations that have a problem with scale, because they can't, having functional big cities in very small island nations is clearly a difficulty. Countries with high youth unemployment, formalizing countries and aging ones. And for each of these, we have examples in the report as to, well, what is the particular challenge? What could be these good jobs for development? And how do countries go about bringing these about? To give you one example of conflict-affected countries, here the social cohesion pillar is very important. The type of jobs programs you have in countries like Kosovo or Liberia are very seldom leading to longer-term job effects. However, the integration effect of bringing ex-combatants into society, of having construction sites that actually make a point out of bringing young people in, and in a very particular way, can be very substantial. And there's good empirical evidence now from both Uganda, northern Uganda, as well as Liberia, as to how public programs and public employment programs can shape norms and behaviors in a positive way. Last part of the report is then policies. And here we have what we call a jobs policy pyramid, where we have fundamentals at the bottom. So these are kind of your Washington consensus fundamentals, plus, so it's not only macro stability, plus a good business environment, but we put in here not only the rule of law, but also the respect for human rights is absolutely fundamental for a longer run, sustainable economic and social development that is based around jobs. The second layer are labor policies. So here is all the classical, in quotation mark, policies we focus on: regulation, job protection, or worker protection, social insurance policies, active labor market policies, and we find that very often the countries can choose a trade-off between these different policies on what we call a plateau, where the effect on efficiency, on the number of jobs, of changing regulation or social insurance policies tends to be relatively small. So much of the literature has been on that very part, on how much is the employment effect of deregulating labor market. And we find very often it's actually pretty small, much smaller at least than we thought. However, that plateau has two cliffs. One is on kind of the right side, where really these regulations become so stifling that firms cannot grow and they can't circumvent them either. On the other hand, there's also a cliff where respect for human rights and basic rights is not there. And at the same time, we don't have basic social protection policies. The big effect in terms of what we came up with for job creation, though, is at the top. These are the priorities. This is where countries bring out these positive developmental impact of jobs through their policies. And that can be policies that support female labor force participation. It can be policies that help the small-scale rural farmer to increase productivity and thereby get people out of poverty. Or it can be really thinking about cities, not only from a public infrastructure perspective, but bringing in city governance and skill building together with infrastructure so that you have cities like Seoul, for example, which function in a very particular way and have been sources of growth. Lastly, we have a number of questions spread out in the report. They're all about 4 or 5 pages long, so make a great reading in case you're in a class which is utterly boring and you want to rather read a full page. Yeah? We've chosen these questions because we struggled with them at the very beginning. And we set up a conventional wisdom for each of them and then explain when is that conventional wisdom kind of true, but when do we have to rethink it. One is growth strategies or job strategies, where we say, well, growth strategies very often are good, but there are circumstances where job strategies need to replace growth strategies. Think about the example of resource-rich countries, which I mentioned. Can entrepreneurship be fostered? It can. However, the most important thing are the most important people to reach are the small enterprises, the self-employed. Many of them will fail. However, a good part of them, about 10% according to our studies, actually has the potential to grow and bring people out of poverty and create jobs, and we discussed how can they be reached. Third, can policies contribute to social cohesion, which Dina will explain. Skills or jobs. Very often we think that if there is a mismatch of skills between what employers demand and what people have, we need to reform the skill building system. But that's not always true. Very often jobs actually pull skills and people learn their skills on the job. And you see the other questions here. Targeted investment climate, competing for jobs at the global level. We have a chapter on globalization in the report and international migration. And also one which I just wanted to spend 1 minute on, which is protecting workers or protecting jobs. Very much the World Bank mantra has been, well, it's really important to protect the workers more than the jobs because you want to facilitate productive reallocation of jobs within an economy. However, in situations where there is a real decoupling of job creation and job destruction, like we have seen in the financial crisis in the industrialized countries, there's really a case to be made that temporary targeted protection of jobs is the right thing to do, as the alternative is simply unemployment and a productivity of zero. So for each of these, we go through a kind of a straw man which we build up, and then we aim at this straw man or a straw woman with some arguments, and I hope you find some of these questions interesting. So now over to Dina, who will dig much deeper into social cohesion and rights.
Thank you. So I'm just going to pick up where
you have two.
Great. Okay, so I'm just going to pick up where Jesko left off and go into a bit more depth on the rights and social cohesion dimensions of the report, which will then lead to Marty's discussion of the work that was done with the case study. So as Jesko mentioned, the rights are really embedded throughout the report in the framework and in the way we define what is a job. So thinking about jobs as activities, work-related activities that do not violate human rights sort of, makes an explicit commitment within the framework. And we like to think that the World Development Report puts rights on the table in a more explicit way than the World Bank has done this before. And thinking about the full range of work-related activities as jobs, including the 1.5 billion people who are working in farming and self-employment as job holders who are entitled to rights, it sort of opens up thinking about how jobs, what a job is and how it should be thought about in various rights-related frameworks. So not just restricting jobs to those people who have contracts or employers and so forth. So then moving to social cohesion, as Jesko showed you, the third pillar of the temple is social cohesion. And when we started this work a little over a year ago, it was in the wake of the Arab Spring and the London summer riots, and there was this sort of intuition on the front pages of the papers that there was some link between having a job or not having a job and social unrest. So these young people in Morocco and Egypt without jobs were driving the Arab Spring. In fact, in Tunisia, as we all know now, the protests there were sparked by a fruit vendor who was not unemployed. He had a job, but he had a very difficult time with his livelihood and negotiating within the regulatory framework. So there was this intuition, these anecdotes, and what we wanted to do in the report is try to sort of empirically pin this down and try to understand what is the relationship between jobs or not having a job and
the ways in which societies function. So we did an extensive literature review, tried to understand how people think about social cohesion, and in the end came up with our own definition, which is the capacity of societies to peacefully manage collective decision-making. So that's kind of long and unwieldy, but the idea is how do societies manage differences? How do societies manage decision-making? So it's not about social cohesion in the sort of former Soviet sense of top-down paternalism and everybody should behave, but it's how can societies function constructively, allowing for voice and allowing for difference, and how do jobs play into that. So what we did is explored this in a number of different ways. We looked at indicators that people tend to look at when they think about social cohesion, including trust and how people interact with each other and the extent to which they trust people in their group and outside their group, the extent to which they engage within civil society and participate in protests or in different groups. We also looked at this idea of fairness, which I'll come back to. And then we did a survey in 4 countries, and you can find more information on this in the website, or we can go into it in the discussion, where we actually asked people about their jobs and how their jobs affected the way they interacted with others. And that was the sort of descriptive exploration of the links between social cohesion and jobs. But then we thought about, okay, what does this mean from a policy perspective? And as Jesko mentioned, one can really think about in different country contexts, particularly in post-conflict countries or countries where there are social tensions, the ways in which programs can be designed to take into account some of these aspects of social cohesion. So just to give you a few sort of images, we worked with some researchers at the London School of Economics who looked closely at the World Values Survey, which actually asks people about the extent to which they trust others and the kinds of jobs they have. And what we found is these are correlation coefficients, so it doesn't imply causality, but we found linkages, particularly in high to lower middle income countries, where people who don't have a job participate less in society, which is the left-hand side, and then people who have jobs which they say are motivating, involve characteristics of independence and creative, actually participate more in civil society. And we found similar results also for signing a petition, participating in a boycott, and so forth. So that's correlation, but then some colleagues looked at a panel survey from Indonesia, which actually hints at some causality. So the chart that's on the screen shows over a 7-year period, it asked people about the extent to which they participate in community groups in villages, and found that people who had moved from unemployment into employment, so people who got a job during that period, were more likely to participate, and people who lost a job during that period were less likely to participate. So some indications that jobs influence how people interact more broadly within society. Jesko mentioned this idea of fairness and the extent to which people perceive society as being fair if they think that jobs are based on what you know rather than who you know. And I won't go into this in detail, but we did some work based on the methodology of inequality of opportunities to try to come up with a quantitative measure of fairness in the labor market and fairness in access to jobs. And the idea here is that one can actually measure the extent to which the circumstances at birth affect your access to a job opportunity. So things that are outside of your control, like your gender, your ethnicity, or your parents' education, in comparison with your own education and your effort. And so this chart that's on the screen shows results from a survey of 27 countries in Europe and Central Asia. And what we found is a large share, I think it's the green, sorry, the blue. So sort of, I don't have a colored paper in front of me, but basically a large share of the inequality in access to a job opportunity is affected by circumstances beyond an individual's control. So the idea that one can measure this aspect of fairness. Then a few words about voice. As Jesko mentioned, we look at these sort of traditional labor market policies that one thinks about when one thinks about how labor markets and jobs function, particularly in developed countries, and we find that the models really don't fit most developing countries. So traditional mechanisms like unions, coverage of unions is very low in most developing countries, largely because most people do not work in situations of an employment contract or of an employer. And that has implications both for access to voice broadly, but the extent to which labor market regulations actually have an impact on people in jobs. So here is where the work that Marty will discuss comes in, where we looked at new forms of voice. Well, actually, I shouldn't say new because we were corrected by our colleagues from SEWA who said this started 40 years ago. But for us at the World Bank, it was more new. So the extent to which self-employed workers, informal wage workers can find channels for organization. So Marty will talk about the case studies here, but what was interesting is that some of these associations lie outside of jobs. They may be community associations, and the extent to which they allow and are allowing workers to access the rights in different ways than formal unions might. So the case study of the Bogota waste pickers that was done showed how that group of people was able to access both constitutional law and the municipal law to make an argument that they should have access to the opportunity to do their trade and to earn their livelihood. The take on voice is really that we need to look beyond the traditional unions and look at how some of the structures such as ILO conventions, which had been set up more around formal unions, can be made accessible to workers outside of formal employment relationships. I'm just going to mention one more thing. I don't have a slide on this, but as Jesko mentioned, we have a section of the report on the global context in the final chapter. And there we also look at this idea of voice and rights and the increasing role that corporate social responsibility movements and private sector initiatives are providing access to rights for workers in developing countries. And what we find there is a lot of activity, particularly, I mean, we see it with the Foxconn debates about Apple and so forth. There's pressure on Western brands to behave appropriately in terms of labor rights and standards in developing countries. But this also is being picked up at the level of developing countries themselves. So there's an increasing number of sort of grassroots efforts, say in Brazil and elsewhere, where local NGOs and civil society movements are putting pressure on the private sector to enforce labor standards and rights. And we talk about an interesting example, which is a partnership between the ILO and the IFC, which is the private sector wing of the World Bank. In general, the report does not talk about World Bank projects or World Bank initiatives. This initiative that I'm talking about now is really the only exception. It's called the Better Work Program, and it's a partnership between those institutions and garment companies to improve standards and rights of workers in the garment industry in a number of countries throughout the world. And what's being found there is that the sort of partnership between the private sector, the government capacity to monitor and inspect and enforce accountability, and civil society is actually having an impact, and they have a very rich program of evaluations which is showing that this is paying off not only for the rights of workers themselves and their conditions, but also is having benefits for the employers in terms of better productivity. So the whole idea that treating your workers can actually improve, there's a business case and can improve opportunities for productivity and growth. So that's an interesting part of the report, which we can talk more about if you're interested. And then lastly, you can't read this slide, but that's not the point. I just wanted to, before we get into the details of Marty's background paper, to mention that there's a website where you can find the full report, but also most of the 50 background papers, eventually all 50 will be there, but most of them are already there, and there are quite a number already up that are related to the topics that we're focusing on today. The first paper on this list is the paper that gets into the fairness indicator and the inequality of opportunities. There's also a paper on the World Value Survey analysis that I mentioned. We have case studies of the alternative dispute mechanisms that workers and employers and the government are using in Cambodia. Also papers on labor market discrimination and so forth. So there's a rich set of resources. I mean, the report is already pretty hefty and hard to carry around, but it does not do justice to the rich detail that's in these background papers. So for those of you with interest in specific topics, I highly recommend looking at the source material, because it's really reflects a lot of amazing and rich work. And then lastly, this is the website, so if in case you don't have it in the materials that were circulated. Also, for those of you who like to read on iPads, there's a free iPad app of the World Development Report in the iTunes. You can go to iTunes and find it, and that's also an alternative to carrying around the asset report. So, over to you, Marty.
So much for advertising. Every time you download it, we actually get something.
It's all free.
Oh, thank you very much. And I realize I've been saying your name wrong all this while.
No, you were fine.
No, I said Jesco.
Oh, that's perfect.
Yeah. While Julia sets up, what I'm going to do is talk about the cases that we wrote for the WDR on economic rights and representative voice. And at the beginning, I'll sort of do one slide each on the three categories of informal workers that we are talking about in the case studies, and how we think about rights, economic rights, and then I'll get into the actual cases. Okay?
Yeah.
Oh, that one. Okay. I haven't been in this classroom since December. So there were 5 case studies. One was sort of an overview of this remarkable organization that Jesco and Dina have talked about, the Self-Employed Women's Association of India. Then we looked at specific cases. One was a national policy that we hope will become a national law for street vendors in India, and it was written by the head of the National Association of Street Vendors of India, Arvind Singh. There was a piece on 2 legal cases for street and market vendors in Durban, South Africa, and I realize in that heading, I should have, it also included the barrow operators, the barrow boys who work in the market. And this was 2 legal cases to stop the building of a mall in the center of a natural market of 7,000 to 8,000 street vendors. Then there's the Constitutional Court judgments in support of waste pickers in Bogota, Colombia, and Lucia Fernandez, who's one of the co-authors, is here, so she can pick up where I make mistakes or leave important things out. And then the final case was a campaign for an international convention on decent work for domestic workers, a successful campaign that the WIGA network, but more importantly, the International Domestic Worker Network was involved in. So I just wanted to have one slide on each of the categories: domestic workers, street vendors, waste pickers, and how we think about economic rights. And each one is, we look at both the negative rights, the freedom from something, and the more positive rights, the freedom to. And who might be the duty bearer when you're talking about economic rights of people who don't have, especially in the case, other two cases, don't have an employer. Domestic workers is the only one where you actually have an employer. And what could be the legal case for the economic rights. So the domestic workers case in some ways is the more classic sort of labor rights case because there is an employer, either the individual or the household. And the negative rights, the rights not to be subjected to harassment, to dangerous work. There was a dreadful case somewhere in the Middle East and North Africa that Human Rights Watch came up with, of women who were in multi-story buildings being asked to clean windows from the outside, and just large numbers had plunged to their death, right? And so it can be extremely dangerous. Unpaid overtime and arbitrary dismissal. Those are the kinds of freedom from those kinds of negative situations. And the more positive is that they should have the right to agreed upon, even if it's not a minimum wage, ideally a minimum wage, and agreed upon other worker rights, such as reasonable work hours and work days per week, overtime pay, paid holidays, and paid sick leave. The duty bearer, it's obvious that there is an employer in this case, but then there are some questions. Sometimes there's a recruitment or placement agency that may actually need to have some of the responsibility and bear some of the duties to these rights. And so then the question is, do we go for a sort of joint liability approach that both the recruitment agency and the individual employer? And that the recruitment placement is particularly acute in the case of migrant domestic workers. But we also hear about problems with, even within a country, rural to urban migrants for domestic. In the case of street vendors, the negative rights, the rights to be free from something, is not to be subject to harassment. Street vendors around the world are harassed on a daily basis. By police, by local authorities. Confiscation of goods, we have a lawyer in South Africa that says it's disproportionate that when a street vendor is caught and they seem to not have a permit to vend, not only do they have to pay a fine, their goods gets confiscated. And he's looking for a test case because he wants to argue this. And he says, when you and I get caught for speeding, we pay a fine, but nobody takes our car. So it's disproportionate. He's going to argue that case. Evictions. We have a system of tracking reported cases in the news, English news, of street vendors and waste pickers. And there's at least one eviction a day around the world reported in the English press that we find. So the positive rights, what they really want is to be able to vend in public spaces under fair and reasonable restrictions. I mean, they don't want to push out everyone else who might want to use that sidewalk, but they do need a secure place to vend. And one of the principles that has been fought for is that there are something we're calling natural markets. So where there's a transport hub or a residential community, or a lot of pedestrian traffic for some reason. Those are where natural markets come up because that's where the customer meets the vendor. And we want to preserve those to the degree possible. Maybe they need to be managed better, but preserve them. And then they want infrastructure services at the vending site. But then the question is, who's the duty bearer in the case of street vendors? Is it the city government? Is it the national government? Who's got this responsibility? And the legal cases that have been argued for economic rights of street vendors have been the right to life, the right to pursue a business, the assumption that they're somehow discriminated against, or some assumption of a disadvantage or vulnerability. These cases have been argued on the basis of these legal arguments. And the question mark is only which is the most powerful of those cases or legal arguments. waste pickers, and here I'm again treading on Lucia's turf because she's our global waste picker coordinator. The waste pickers want the right not to be subject to harassment, bribes, and evictions by the city authorities, and or arbitrary prices in the recycling chain. And they want the right of access to waste and the rights to inclusion in modern waste management systems. They want fair prices for the recyclables, and they want infrastructure for sorting and storing the waste. Again, the question is, who's the duty bearer? Is it the city government? Is it the national government? Or is there some recyclers higher in the chain? Because recycling is big business, and there are really powerful vested interests higher up in the chain. And the legal cases that have been argued on the right to livelihood, the right to pursue business, the assumption of discrimination, and the assumption of disadvantage or vulnerability, much like in the street vendor case. Most of these legal arguments are embedded or enshrined in the constitutional law rather than existing statutory law. So now to the cases. The Domestic Workers Convention. This is an ILO convention. There is a very established process in the tripartite International Labor Organization and how you get a convention. The governing body decides that a topic should be on the agenda. There are 2 years in a row that it's discussed if it's a standard-setting topic. The first year there's a preliminary vote between the 3 parties of the ILO system, the government, the employers, and the workers. And then the second year there's the final vote. And there's a lot of technical work that gets done to bring out reports, almost the size of this, on domestic workers and what we know about them and what we know about legal systems for them. And there's a political process, clearly, of the organizations of the domestic workers trying to ensure that the governments and the workers will support them. The employers in the ILO context, it's an interesting anomaly because the employers of domestic workers don't only come from the employer block of the tripartite system. They come from the worker block and the government block. So that we didn't really know where the employers would come out on this particular convention. Other conventions, we know that the employers tend to block conventions in support of workers. So, and there was a very extensive campaign and engagement at all levels, and you had to mobilize the domestic workers and their organizations, and then they had to begin to interface with the Ministry of Labor and other groups in their own country, and they had to be able to engage at the International Labor Conference as well. The WIGO network brought delegates of domestic work organizations to a prior International Labor Conference just so they would see how the process worked. I think it was 2009, and then 2010 was the preliminary vote, and 2011 was the final. And they got very sophisticated, but we had to partner them with press, media people, with legal advisors. They had a team of researchers on domestic work that backed them up, so the delegation could work effectively in the conference. And the convention was passed. It was one of the larger majority votes. And it says that domestic workers are unconditionally defined as workers, and they should have the same protections as other workers. The complication is how do you inspect labor in a household? But there are mechanisms and some wonderful examples of how you get around that constraint. Street vendors, 2 of the cases had to do with street vendors. In India, the first major victory for street vendors was a Supreme Court judgment, I think in 1986, that Seva in India got the now Solicitor General of India to fight. And then they worked hard with relevant ministries, labor and urban, on a national policy which came into place in 2004, and I think was revised in 2010. But now there's a national law being reviewed as we speak by Parliament. And it was felt that a national law had more power than national policy, because national policy gets sort of diluted as it goes down from the federal level to the state level to the city level. And the principles on which the policy and the law are being argued are these right to bend and the right to bend in public space. And I've just listed those. You can find more details later. In the South Africa case, there was this natural market around the transport node of Durban, South Africa, with 7,000 to 8,000 vendors. Different physical infrastructure to support the 12 different product markets in that area. And one of those was something called the early morning market. It was a heritage building from the colonial era, pre-apartheid British colonial era. And it was stall holders, actually, who were in the market and sold fruit and vegetables. And with the World Cup coming to Durban, South Africa, the city decided to build a mall in the middle of the natural market, right where the early morning market was placed. And there were local associations of street vendors, there were sympathetic academics, there were historians who knew the heritage value, and there was this legal resource center headed by Mahendra Chetty. And they put 2 cases against the city, one on the basis of the heritage site, that you have to preserve heritage sites. And the other was on the basis of administrative law, because the city had given the land lease to a large black firm without any tender or bid and no transparency. Now what happened is they never went to court. The city just sort of rescinded its lease of land and sort of bowed out. And the people who were involved in this campaign wished they'd been able to go to court, because there was a lot that they could have exposed. But there is no mall, and the natural market still exists. The waste pickers in the court cases in Colombia. In Bogota, Colombia, there's an association of recicladores, Bogota. And then there are other organizations also of waste pickers in the city. And they have, over the years, fought for the rights to waste and also for the right to bid for solid waste management contracts. And the Constitutional Court of Colombia, because of really active pro bono lawyers and very sympathetic judges, have ruled in their favor on 2 or 3 occasions. And these are some of the legal arguments that they've argued. And most recently, in December 2011, there was a ruling from the Constitutional Court that the association was entitled to bid for a solid waste management contract. And it effectively put on hold $1.37 billion US of solid waste management contracts that had been issued to just a handful of companies for 8 years. And so they've got their bid in. The negotiations are still ongoing with the city, but it's a major precedent-setting ruling and process that we're very excited and worried about. So those are the economic rights. The right to representation, which was also a theme in the WDR. And Dina had a slide that showed that the formal mechanisms of the trade unions and the regular collective bargaining agreements with the capital C and B&A don't obtain to informal workers. And so they are finding and making their own demands to have representation. And they need representation that in collective bargaining that takes a different form, because they need to be there sometimes with the recycling chain, sometimes with the city, sometimes with the police. They're the bargaining partners when you're an informal self-employed are multiple, which is very different than the standard collective bargaining agreement. So there's a lot of innovation happening. And we now have a case study that Gina and Miesco don't know about that we've just done on 6 collective bargaining arrangements. And it's very interesting. And it looks at what interests they're fighting for, who are the bargaining parties, how did these bargaining forum get set up, how many of them are now statutory, which is what is the ideal. And I'll just skip the next slide and just say lessons learned. Common barriers and constraints. Often the sort of institutional environment is either inappropriate and or outright hostile. There are competing vested interests in each of the sectors. And the mindset of influential stakeholders is they just don't understand how you think about economic rights or about representative voice if you are not an employee with a formal employer. People just don't know how to think about it. The common strategies, all of them were involved organizing and awareness building of all the different stakeholders, not just the workers on the ground, but the mainstream. Advocacy and legal struggles, plus some test cases. And all the actions on the different fronts sort of fed into each other. The coalition that formed around Durban was very powerful, and it did include academics, lawyers, organizations, and others. And then they all needed technical and political support. And this included pro bono lawyers, activist academics, that's people like myself, specialized non-governmental organizations, and most importantly, the organizations of the informal workers had to form alliances at either the city level, if it was the street vendors and waste pickers, or at the international level for the convention. Otherwise, you just can't get these kinds of victories. And so just the concluding thoughts. The economic rights are not simply the right to work, but more fundamentally what we call the right to livelihood, because it takes so many different forms, livelihoods. And how representative voice is the right to organize, and then a right of those organizations to have direct representative voice and a seat at the policy table. What policy table, which forum, will depend on the sector. But any rule setting and policy making bodies and processes, and ideally what we're hoping for is that some of these will become permanent statutory collective bargaining processes. Thank you. So now I know we lost a lot of people because of classes begin at 1:10. So, but
Are you
thank
sure that's why we lost them? I'm just wondering. If not, we could have closed the school.
Yeah. Well, we've got a good hardcore here, and let's see, thank you. I wanted to.
Yeah, I had a class till 1 o'clock.
Yes. She's the person from the Human Rights Kick that helped organize. And I should also acknowledge Julia and Karen, who's the table. So that's us, and we still have almost an hour, as long as you guys have energy. Should we aim to talk till 1:30? Or, yeah, does that seem about right? Okay. So just open it up and have questions that any or all, or of Lucia, or whatever. And introduce yourself when you...
Yes. I'm a research fellow at Kennedy School. Yes, I come from China. Now, thank you for your wonderful address. I have 2 questions. The first one is for Dina. Yes, you just now highlighted the important role of jobs shaping the social cohesion. So, but in opposite logic, how to identify the social interactions impacting opportunities in access to jobs. So I think, could you introduce more details about how to shape the opportunities to access in jobs? So this is the question for Dina. And another is for Jessica. And could you talk a little bit more about the distinct layers of policies, as you mentioned? Mm-hmm. So there are 3 layers of policies in terms of job promotion. So how to comprehensively design the appropriate policy to promote creating jobs. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take two more and then let the panelists respond. Anyone else? Those are very good questions, by the way. Yes.
I have a question. Oh, sorry, I'm Aria. I'm the MVP from 06, and I work at an NGO that works with CANASFIT, the New Training University Service Committee. I just had a question if you could say a little bit more about the international policy frameworks, kind of building off of the ideas that ILO Convention on Domestic Works and kind of what you see as sort of prerequisites and prospects for such things developing for waste pickers and treatment.
Yes.
I'm Eduardo. I'm a Destiny Leadership Fellow. Does the report consider cost of labor, including tax and free benefits in countries? And another question, how about evaluation, management of the informal and informal labor? Evaluation, measurement of informal labor.
Okay, I can answer. Yes, I think so, yeah.
No, thank you. These are great questions. So on the interaction between jobs and social cohesion, I guess one thing I should have said at the beginning is that we thought a lot about how jobs influence social cohesion and how they affect how people interact. But it's obviously also a two-way relationship, and there's ways in which the sort of structure of society also influences jobs and what opportunities are available. And so maybe two thoughts in response to your question. One is when we were thinking about this indicator of access to employment opportunities and fairness, it's very complicated because there's so many factors going on that, and many of which are unobservable. So we have, on the one hand, things that are outside of an individual's control, and we were able to look at things like gender and parents' education as a proxy for the sort of social structure. From some countries, we had whether a parent had been part of the Communist Party, because these were former Soviet countries, as a proxy again for sort of access to networks and social relations. On the other side, the factors that are within an individual's control, the attributes, things like efforts and we had a lot of debates about talent being innate or learned, or can be very difficult to measure. So we know that what we came up with is very rough and not imperfect, but this idea that you could think about in different societal contexts how fairness plays out in the labor market. I mean, the methodology that we use is something that's been increasingly applied to access for children to basic social services. So the idea was to apply that. But I think in thinking about the environment of opportunities, and also thinking about the context of, say, the Arab Spring, there's also a desire to say, okay, well, how do you make labor markets more fair? How do you increase access to opportunity? And so the policy space, I think, it's a new area, but we were thinking in that respect about ways in which, if you think about civil service employment, ways in which it could be made more fair in terms of, affirmative action is certainly one policy that's been used to increase access to opportunities for traditionally excluded groups. One can think about ways in which contracting for things like municipal waste collection could be made more fair in terms of contracting practices. That's the public sector. In the private sector, there's initiatives to make corporate boards more inclusive of women and minorities. So you know, it's a difficult area and the policy levers aren't immediately obvious, but you know, we try to put some ideas out there, but I'd be also very interested in your thoughts on the question. Maybe just, somebody asked about the international policy framework, and maybe you'll talk about the prospects for the other groups. We look at this a bit in the last chapter of the report, thinking about you know, the extent to which the conventions have bite, right? Because there's, I don't know, 200 and something ILO conventions covering everything under the world. You know, to what extent do the conventions, you know, that attempt to, you know, protect the rights and standards of workers, do they have bite? And there's an interesting paper by Ravi Kanbor, who Marty knows well, and co-author, that shows that there are peer pressure effects of convention ratification, so that within like groups of countries, if one country ratifies, then there's sort of a snowballing effect, which suggests that countries feel that they have a stake in ratification and that it actually means something. But you know, the challenge of these conventions is really you know, implementation, and that's why this example that I gave of the Better Work program is interesting, because it thinks about how at the workplace level the employer, civil society, and employees can come together to actually enforce accountability.
Great. Maybe to the policy question, again, very nice question. So what we tried to do in this last chapter is say, well, how could this pyramid actually work in specific countries? And the fundamental of the idea about this base pillar is that it would really apply across countries, and that all countries need to have the fundamentals in place. So if you have macroeconomic instability, as some countries now do, forging their inflation numbers, including in Latin America, all that creates an environment which is not conducive to long-term business investments. Same thing that we looked at the enterprise surveys. A positive business investment environment is important. If you go through literally these hundreds of enterprise surveys, actually labor regulation does not come up as one of the top priorities. It's generally electricity, public infrastructure, and then the rule of law or governance, which is really the most important, our most important drivers, our most important constraints for companies to invest. Again, we talked about the human rights part of the rule of law, which is for us really fundamental to be applied across countries, so that we see very little ideas of having a variation of phasing in these basic human rights that would be very much against the spirit of having a level under which these core labor standards should not fall. The second part, and then the labor policies, and here what we try to do is give examples as to when countries might be on this plateau. So we have quite a few evaluation studies that show that raising or lowering the minimum wage in Indonesia is not impacting so much on the absolute quantity of employment, but we also have examples of these cliffs. On the one hand side, India, the IDA Act, the Industrial Disputes Act from 1947, it was, which really is a constraint to many businesses of hiring. It doesn't mean that it's the only constraint, but it would be one example where we would be off this plateau where the efficiency effects are simply very strong. The most important part, which kind of intellectually I would almost say, for us is this top of the pyramid, which are the priorities. And here we have examples for each of the different challenges. So for example, for a conflict country, we look at Rwanda and what Rwanda had done after the genocide of trying to integrate, especially the ex-combatants, into society. And there's both impact evaluations as well as broader studies that show how there was really a positive dynamic created through a number of public policies and then also through broader economic policies that raised, for example, productivity in the coffee sector, which was one of the big creators of jobs later on. For youth unemployment, actually our example is Slovakia. And very often when we think of Slovenia, sorry, very often when we think about youth employment or youth unemployment, we think, well, it must be the skill building system which is at fault. But here it was really the stifling of opportunities before the country opened up, was integrated in the European Union, and created opportunities for young people really to get jobs. So our sense of the kind of youth unemployment in many countries, that it's more privilege and the lack of a transparent environment in which firms can really create jobs rather than the skill building system, which very often follows the incentives which are provided by the economy at large. So we go through these different examples for formalizing countries, which brings me to the next question. We actually have Mexico. So in formalizing countries, that which you talked about, that the taxes on labor, the social security contributions which firms and employees have to contribute, can be really important of impacting on the choice, in quotation mark, where people work, if in the informal or formal sector, or if enterprises go formal or informal. And we did quite some work, especially in the Latin American countries, on evaluating these additional costs, as you put them, of labor and employment. And we find that very often the effect is there, but it's not the major effect. It's not the major constraint of creating more and also better employment. So the evaluation studies from Mexico, which for example look at the impact of its Seguro Popular, which is the general health insurance, non-contributory one, the same as the CAFES program and social safety net program in Argentina. They all show at the margin impacts, but you cannot explain 40-50% informality in these countries by simply the labor cost that is levied on employees. So we go quite a bit into contingent evaluation of insurance systems, of labor taxes, and we have quite some statistics, especially in the annex. And then I leave the definition of the informal sector to the
I'll just
expert.
pick up on the international convention. We've only been able to secure 2 international conventions for informal workers. One is domestic workers, and the other is home workers. And both of them which are industrial out workers who work in value chain. In both cases, there's sort of, at least the ILO in its mindset understands it, because it's sort of wage employment, dependent employment. When it cuts to be self-employment, it's much harder. And waste pickers would love a convention to speak, but I'm not fully confident that we're there yet, because one, the whole ILO apparatus really doesn't yet understand the self-employed. And then there's the larger question under human rights law or economic rights law as to who really is responsible for the fact that street vendors are denied access to the space and waste pickers are denied access to waste. It's a failure of the state, but I don't think it's quite as easy to capture in one of those conventions. But I would agree that the organizations of workers, even if these conventions don't have fights, they use them in all kinds of ways. It becomes hugely important. You know, if the convention says we need better statistics on home-based workers, they use that to set up a committee in South Asia to work on getting better statistics, so they do use it. On the definition and measurement of informal employment, I'm happy to say that there are standard, official, international statistical definitions of the informal sector, which is the enterprises that are unincorporated, unregistered, and small, and of something, a larger phenomenon called informal employment, which looks at the worker rather than the enterprise, and it's workers who do not get social protection through their work, right? And those are accepted definitions. And now we have 80 countries around the world that are using that in their collection and tabulation of official data. And we have a web data archive, the ILO and the WIDO network on the ILO website with the data so collected for the 80 countries. So there is, just don't let people tell you there isn't a definition. There is. And it is being measured, and it's measured through labor force surveys. And they just go into a household and says, what does Rajiv do, and what does Shanta do, and what does, and people say, right? And we can count it. And if it's 94% of all workers in India, people are not hiding it. I mean, people can, you can't count it now. If it's 94% of workers saying they're informally employed, you can count it, right? And so, yeah, there's a lot of work that's been done. So, another, yes.
I have a strange question. Is there
Introduce yourself.
Alexis Fallon. I'm actually just a practicing tax attorney.
Oh,
My
okay.
work is I represent 3,700 Chinese garment workers in a class action suit against the U.S. government for improper levying of FICA taxes.
Oh, good.
Yeah, so there, you know,
What
so I'm
kind
the
of
people
work
that do the practical. Yeah, so I'm a tax attorney. So I'm on the side of I'm hanging out in academia, going, wow, this is really great theory. I can tell you federal judges don't follow theory, but in any event, most of my work has been dealing with the rights of people who do not have official representation within the U.S. immigration system, and how the U.S. treats these undocumented workers and how they actually use tax policy to integrate them in and count them as a part of our labor pool. So we get statistics based on using our tax authorities to pull them in, and that's how we can count the number of heads. It's called the NITIN program, which is an individual tax identification number. They use that program in order to track and get compliance. But the other corollary is, and this is part of my case, is dealing with how do we treat the benefits accrued. So for example, if you do validly collect FICA taxes and the employer does do the match, does the worker have any entitlement to the social insurance? Now we have the informal market now being formalized through government regulation and being tracked through government bodies, and the question is whether or not they have any entitlement. And the answer is no, they do not. And what has happened is that they've become like a funding source for, I have no idea why Congress has decided to do it this way, but for whatever reason they wish to enforce compliance and put the burden and the pain upon the worker's salary in order to encourage lawful compliance with U.S. immigration laws. So the way it is that the reason why you don't get Social Security benefits is because you're not lawful and you chose to be undocumented. But yet the government doesn't create any mechanism to become documented, so, you know,
They're
it's
collecting taxes from unnaturalized.
Yeah, like for me, in my case, I work in the U.S. possessions, which deals with an area that is outside the U.S. immigration laws formally, and the IRS continued their policy, which they have on a national level, to incorporate the U.S. possessions. So even though the U.S. possessions do not have formal U.S. immigration laws applying, meaning you do not go through a U.S. border to work there, the IRS use their policies that they apply nationally because it's a part of the United States to tax all workers.
Wow.
So in any event, that's kind of what I've been doing for a while.
Where would the possessions then?
The one I'm working with is Saipan. So you guys have probably heard of it, about the garment industry there. And so I'm like the last of the Mohicans, as I watched most of my workers leave to go back to China, was how did U.S. policies actually work? So it's actually a great case study. You guys ever want to look at it? It's at the end of it, it's like as we're leaving, as Elvis is leaving the building. No, as everything's closing down.
Wasn't it Kathy Lee Giffords?
So where is this physically?
It's 2 islands up from Guam.
Oh.
It's about 3.5 hours south of Japan, about 4 hours away from China. And the major garment factories, they had about, at the height of their time, about 60,000 garment workers, mainly women. And it was the first experience for mainland China to actually do any kind of economic exterior economic development where they let their workers go outside of China. And this started in 1984. So you have to remember, for China to even, as I'm sure you can correct me, but for China in 84 to allow mainlanders to leave and go to a U.S. possession, that in itself is a unique experience because it was very unheard of to do this. It was a very unique experience for the Chinese government. I think they were looking towards economic development as I think from the Chinese government's perspective, they were looking at a way of trying out international economic development models. Similar to what we do in the U.S. all the time is when we invest in foreign countries, but this was the first foray using workers. But in any event, when I come back to this whole idea of how governments treat informal workers, I guess I want to ask, is there more of a push by governments to formalize work as opposed to what I'm wondering is, yes, we've done a great study and yes, there's a lot of the informal market, but is there more of a pressure within the countries to formalize as much as they can the labor? Does that make sense? So like, as you guys study it, is there more of a sense like with the waste pickers, is there a push back trying to get a more tracking mechanism, trying to integrate them in as full, not informal?
Can I just?
Yes, go ahead. I was thinking that you would jump.
Yeah, I mean, the standard policy response to the informal is let's formalize,
okay,
right?
All right.
Now, the question is, what do people mean by that, right?
Right.
Now, in the mainstream economic debates, it's mainly about informal self-employed operators or the enterprises. And formalization means let's get them to register and pay taxes. Right? Now, if you come over to the informal wage labor, right? The same mainstream economists who want the informal enterprises to register and pay taxes do not favor labor regulations, right? And so what you're actually getting is more informalization of wage labor. Now, so then the question is, what do people really mean by formalization? Now, to some mind, all of these activities are just dead end, they're going to go away, let's just get them all formal wage jobs, right? That's one meaning of it, right? Everything, all the data everywhere in the world tells us that the opposite is happening. We're not expanding formal wage jobs, right? Right. For informal jobs that are expanding. Isn't that true?
Probably if you take a really long view of decades, I wouldn't say it's true. So I think you have a formalization, but it's extraordinarily slow.
Yeah, okay.
And it's way too slow to get people who are today in informality out of poverty.
And with the millions of youth coming into the labor market, right?
Yeah.
I think it also differentiates by country and region, right?
Yeah.
So,
But in general, what we find in the data, in general, is that what you have an expansion of is self-employment, various kinds, and wage employment outside, yeah, informal wage employment in lots of countries. So that, yes, please create formal wage opportunities, and that's what you mean by formalization, fine. If the second meaning is that you just want them to register and pay taxes, we also say fine, but they too will want benefits of being formal, right? And so for us, formalization, we do want it, but it's a different form. It's allowing them to have a representative voice, if they're paying taxes, to get some benefits. So it depends what formalization means. And my feeling is that most of these societies, people will continue to do these activities. Lucia works with waste pickers. The counterfactual for them is selling prostitution, and they find dignity in the work. You can hear them say it, right? Now, there's some really degraded forms, especially at the dump sites and all, and dangerous. But they're fighting for their right to pursue their occupation. So it's a complicated set of issues. Every time I go out with people in to see the reality, there's some that just said these activities just are going to go away. Right? They're dead end, they're going to go away. Right? And yet, all you see is them expanding. So we have a real development challenge to create more formal jobs, to say formalization is not just registration and taxes, it's also the benefits that come with that. And then we have to assume that a lot of people are going to continue in these activities in the near future. Their kids may not want to, but I just spent 2 days and 2 nights with a street vendor who, this is their traditional hereditary occupation forever. This is what she and her husband have done, the ancestors before them. The kids don't want to do it, but the girls, none of them have education. The son has failed 10th class exams 3 times in a row. So it's a huge development failure, and we have to come to grips with it. It's hard, but your case is really important. We want to follow up and see what you're really interested in. So, well, it's past 1:30. I really appreciate the time that everyone has taken, and let's see, you missed it. The room was really full.
Yeah. It was hanging room early.
It's so sad because most students have mandatory classes at this time.
Yeah.
11:30 to 1.
Yeah.
Can I make just one last advertisement?
Sure.
We have tried, at the back of the report, we've tried to put together both conventional but also non-conventional statistics. And you will find there for these 3 different dimensions which we had, living standard, productivity, and social cohesion, quite a few indicators. Everything from trust of people in jobs to informality, whatever definition you want to use, productivity in firms and productivity changes, what firms say, rights, ILO conventions signed. So we hope that this is actually for you, maybe for your work, also database you might be able to use. So that was the last
That's great.
advertisement.
Yeah, it's a real.
And now we rest our